Assalamu alaikum, dear students. I hope you are doing fine. Welcome to the 12th lecture of public finance. After going through a few lectures, we have covered the main one of the main areas, the role of the government in public finance and role of the public government in the economy as such. And during that we actually spent 4 lectures on that, discussing the public goods, the voters, and how the political outcomes are reached. And in the last lecture, basically what we discussed was the effect of voting and not voting. We were discussing the collective, the cost and benefits of collective action, and how there are various mechanisms through which different rules are used to make public choices. Now then, in the last lecture we discussed the effect of non-voting. Before that we had already established that during any choice of a political platform, the parties and the political candidates usually target the median voters. Why? Because median voters' preferred outcome would be the political equilibrium. But then later on, we in the scenario of not voting, we discussed that if what would happen to the political equilibrium if certain people or certain group of people decide not to vote. And then we discussed that why would they come to a stage where they would decide not to vote. There are certain reasons, like one of the reasons would be people are indifferent about various platforms of the political candidates or the political parties. Why that can be? Because since the parties and candidates are targeting the median voters, and if they are targeting the median voters and their preferred outcome, then they are bound to come closer together. So there is a possibility that voters would be indifferent about indifferent about the various political platforms, so they might decide not to vote. Then there are other reasons why people would or voters would abstain from voting. One of the reasons was that their preferred outcome is too far away from the alternatives being presented to them. So if their preferred outcome is very far away, maybe if all the parties are targeting the median and median voters' preferred outcome, and they are on this voter is on the extremes, then he might not choose to vote, and that would be a rational decision, considering that he would not be able to affect the political outcome and the cost of voting, considering the cost of voting in terms of the time value of money and visit to the poll, or as well as the time consumed on collection of information. So if costs are greater than the benefit, then he would choose not to vote. We discussed that earlier, but we are just bringing it up again because we also discussed that in the last lecture as well. Then when certain people decide not to vote, then it depends on considering a normal curve, since we assume that voters are distributed along a normal curve on their preferred outcomes, and the mean would be actually the median voter also. So in that case, if voters from both sides, both extremes, decide not to vote, then it won't affect the political outcome that much. But if voters from a certain side decide not to vote, then the result would shift towards the mode rather than the median. Mode is actually the most frequent value in the distribution. So one political party, maybe towards the extreme, might win. And then if the distribution is asymmetric and it is multimodal, then it is very difficult to say where the result would land or where would be the political equilibrium. Now then in the last lecture we also discussed the concept of log rolling, which is basically vote trading. And in order to understand that concept in more detail, we had an example to express that log rolling might result to inefficiency. To prove that, we considered three voters, and voter A, B, and C. Voter A preferred, for example, wanted to vote for number of security guards, and for that, voter B and C had a marginal benefit equal to 0, so they would not vote for it, and that won't be the political equilibrium. On the other hand, C wanted like firework displays, that is a sort of entertainment public good, and voter A and B were not like, they had their marginal benefit equal to 0 in that case, so only C would vote, and that won't be the political equilibrium. So there would be no firework displays, and there would be no security guards. But we said that if A and B collude together, A and C collude together, and if they vote for each other also, if they trade vote, in fact, that A would say that, okay, if you vote for me, I would vote for you as well. So, or maybe the resolution is packaged together. In that case, the resolution would be passed because there would be two votes of A and C, and B would be for example, the loser in that case. And we also considering giving like the tax shares and the marginal benefit out of it, we showed that the marginal cost was much higher than the sum of marginal benefits, and only A and C would be better off, but the whole scenario would not be optimal or efficient, and more of the public good is being supplied because marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit or sum of marginal benefits. So vote trading might result into an inefficiency. Then in the last lecture we also discussed the concept of in the political process. Before this we had been discussing like effect of political candidates or the political parties or the voters, but then we brought in another affecting group which we termed as special interest groups. Special interest groups can be labor unions, a group of environmentalists trying to protect the environment, and we discussed special interest groups in detail, and these special interest groups are mostly targeting the interests of members of their group, and they want the benefits for their members, and that might result, they can pressure voters or bureaucrats or politicians and policy makers towards like gaining their personal benefits, maybe subsidies, maybe protection of their jobs. We discussed an example of agriculture, for example. Maybe a group of agriculturists can influence the government for giving them a subsidy or maybe protection from imports, and in that case they might result into inefficient outcomes. And we also discussed that the burden of that sort of a subsidy would be borne by majority. Well, we discussed certain scenarios in special interest groups, but we do not need to go into detail in that. Then we also discussed the bureaucracy as another group influencing the public choice. Bureaucracy is basically is responsible for production and supply of the public goods, which comes out as political equilibrium through the public political institutions. Now, what bureaucracy would do is, because bureaucracy does not own those resources and does not own the production, so they are less inclined towards efficient outcomes. But there was a theory of public choice in which we discussed that this bureaucracy is basically hungry for power, and that power is correlated with the number of resources they have, and that number of resources are correlated with the size of the budget allocated to them. So we also discussed through a graph that they might push, because they have detailed information about the cost and benefits, so they can manipulate that. It is a possibility they might manipulate that. So there is a risk that they would cause inefficient outcomes. Specifically, we discussed that in a graph where marginal cost was greater than marginal benefit, because they were focusing on the total social cost and total social benefit, and they would take them to the point like rather than keeping the gap maximum in terms of net benefit, they would take them to the point up to where total social benefit is equal to total social cost. But at that point their slopes, marginal social cost and marginal social benefit, are not at the optimal level. So this is where we concluded the topic of public choice and the political process, and how various alternatives come out, and how we are facing how taxes are decided, and how do people vote for it, and what are various rules under which decisions are taken. And we also discussed the inefficient outcomes because of interest of various parties in the whole scenario. Now we are taking this further. We are going to focus on the expenditure side of the government. We will be discussing certain scenarios from this lecture onwards. There is like cost benefit analysis and government investments. Whenever a government does an investment, actually that affects the whole economy actually, because without the involvement or expenditure of the government, the wheel of economy might not move, because there are certain public goods which private sector, profit maximizing private sector won't be willing to provide, because that won't be generating as much as profit maximization as they would expect. So the government's involvements and government investments also boost the involvement of the private sector. For example, roads built by governments are used by the private sector for transportation of goods. Airports built by the government also support. So all the infrastructure basically built by the government is very important for the private sector also, and their investments actually also provide foundations for investments by the private sector. So moving on with this scenario, we would be discussing the economic analysis of the budget process. Now, what would be the aim of this? The aim is achieving the least cost means of accomplishing an authorized objective. The whole budget process, how various programs are implemented in the economy. The aim of all this analysis is why there is a need to conduct an economic analysis of all the programs being implemented by the government. That the aim is that the least cost means of accomplishing any authorized objective. Objective can be of any sort, and various government departments come together, and they might be like focusing on one single objective. For example, there are hospitals providing healthcare and treatment. There are, like, for example, Ministry of Health with the health services programs. Then even in taking it to the extreme, for the well-being of individuals, national highway authorities or administration of the motorways also needs budgets for improvement of health. So what government needs to see is that whatever the objective is, like maybe increasing the life expectancy of birth or reducing the mortality rate through various government programs, but their objective is same. So what would be the least cost method of achieving those objectives? A program is a combination of government activities producing a distinguishable output. Now, distinguishable output might be, as I said, that maybe they want to increase the life expectancy or at birth, or maybe they want to reduce the mortality rate or death rate. So this outcome might be achieved by various actions of the government, like maybe for example a polio vaccination moved by the government, or maybe through reduction of accidents on highways and motorways, maybe through fire prevention. So all these in fact working together, the objective is same, that is reducing the mortality rate. So a program of the government is a combination of government activities, maybe through various departments, which is producing a distinguishable output. So what governments through its analysis of the budget process needs to do is to find the optimal level of or the least cost means of achieving that objective. Now, program budgeting is the system of managing government expenditures, attempting to compare the program proposals of all government agencies authorized to achieve a similar objective. So the aim of program budgeting is basically to see all the various initiatives of different departments in terms of their programs all together in one package, rather than looking at them independently, because that there might be, for example, repetition, and there might be one of the programs might be ineffective rather than the other program. So in that case, the government needs to see all those programs together, and that is not possible under the line budgeting. That is only possible possible under the program budgeting, because government would look at various objectives of different government agencies altogether. Again, as I said, that for example reduction of air pollution, or highway safety, or for example polio vaccinations, or cancer research, and all these things, the aim of all these activities by various government agencies is same. The aim is to, for example, increase the life expectancy of birth, or reduce mortality rate, or in simple words, to prolong human life. So it is only possible through a program budgeting, which we would come to an example to explain this concept, how it can take place. Then cost effectiveness analysis is basically a technique for determining the minimum cost combination of different government programs to achieve a given objective. Now, what the objective is? Objective is to prolong human life, for example. Then that prolongation of human life can be taken up by various government agencies. Now, one of the agency might put up a very efficient proposal for fire safety system. The other agency might be putting up a proposal for air safety, for example road traffic accident prevention. The third agency might be proposing a program for cancer research. So there are like 3 or 4 or 5 different agencies whose aim is, the main objective of their programs is to increase the life expectancy at birth, or prolong human life. So how can government decide that which one would be the least cost method of achieving the given objective? The objective has been defined. So policy makers can see the trade-off between programs of various agencies which have basically the similar objective. Trade-off would be in a sense that if there is a limited amount of budget, because since all those agencies programs which they have asked for they need to request for funds for that. So budget needs to be allocated to those agencies. So what they can do is that they need to see the trade-off between those two, considering the effectiveness of their program as well as the achievement of the objective. So they even might to distribute the budget between 2 or 3 programs, and they might need to allocate the whole budget to one of the programs depending on the available scenario. And this comparison is not visible under line budgeting, in which case every agency's proposal is looked at independently. So what the government does is, what the government can do is, they can look at the objectives, and if they can bundle up all such programs which have the similar objective. For example, in the example that we are taking along is increase prolong citizens' life. So all those proposals or all those programs can be bundled up together, and then government can see the minimum cost ideal scenario in which that can be done. So this is an example of cost-effective analysis. We have discussed ISO-CONTs before and ISO-cost before, but just to refresh your memory, I would narrate them again. There is a graph being shown on the screen, in which case there is an x-axis. On the x-axis is the quantity of output that is being produced. Now, do not focus on the names of x and y axis right now. Just try to understand the concept of ISO-CONT. Now, ISO-CONT basically represents a same level of quantity in which that can be achieved through various levels of capital and labor in general, not considering this scenario over here. ISO-CONT is a convex curve, and along the slope of the ISO-CONT moving downwards, there is a marginal rate of technical substitution. Now, usually when we are discussing a single level of production, for example, we are considering 100 kilometers road. That kilometer road can be produced through, for example, 100 units of labor and 3 units of capital, and that can also be produced through 50 units of labor and maybe 10 units of capital. So ISO means same, quant means quantity. ISO-CONT would be a single convex curve representing a quantity of 1000 kilometers of road that can be produced through various combinations of capital and labor. number. And then now taking it to this graph that is being shown on the screen, on the x-axis there is smoke detectors per year, and there are like two sorts of proposals by different government agencies. Maybe the fire protection department is proposing that we can install smoke detectors, certain amount of smoke detectors in all the public places, or maybe all the public offices or at homes even. And on the y-axis there is inoculations per year or vaccinations per year, and one of the department, maybe the health department, is proposing that we can vaccinate people so that there is lesser risk of death from disease. And the output, the total ISO count actually represents lives saved equal to 5,000. So both of these programs can result into saving lives of 5,000 citizens. Now that is why this ISO count represents 5,000 lives saved through various combinations of vaccinations and installation of smoke detectors. For example, point B represents 20,000 vaccinations and also 10,000 smoke detector installation per year, and that would also save lives of up to 5,000 individuals. And point A represents now in order to, there is a trade-off between that is being shown on x and y axis because of the convex shape. So if you want to increase the installation of smoke detectors, you need to reduce the quantity of vaccinations per year. So at point A it is represented that we have increased the smoke detectors from 10,000 to 20,000 per year, and for that we have to reduce the vaccinations from 20,000 to 10,000. This is and both of these combinations will approximately save 5,000 lives. Now this is an ISO count that is being represented by a convex shape curve showing saving of 5,000 lives through taking up various government programs. Now what would be the optimal point? Now let us discuss those optimal points. Now for that we need to understand the ISO cost line, or a family of ISO cost lines that is being represented, parallel lines from that parallel straight lines from x-axis to y-axis. Now ISO cost is basically a same cost sort of scenario. ISO means same, cost means cost. Now a single ISO cost from that, for example the one that originates from 20,000 to 10,000, 20,000 vaccinations to 10,000 smoke detectors, this ISO cost represents that various combinations of vaccinations and smoke detectors that would represent, that can be achieved by a same amount of budget. Let's assume that we have a budget of 10,000. So what are the for example we have a budget for $1 million. So what is the combinations of these two various combinations that can be bought using that same amount of budget? That is represented by ISO cost. That's why its name ISO cost, costing at the same level the various combinations that cost at the same level. So these parallel lines of ISO cost lines are representing like for example the one that is closest to the origin represents the lowest cost scenario, then the one that is next to it towards outside the origin represents the other ISO cost, which would be of course having a higher cost, but it also shows say some combinations of inculations and smoke detectors that would be coming through within that budget limit or within that cost scenario or same ISO cost. So there are various combinations of these inculations per year and smoke detectors that are being represented by each ISO cost. Now what would be the optimal point? For example, since the one ISO count represents same quantity, that is in our case is 5,000 lives being saved, so there are 2 points highlighted over here. We can either use that on for example point B, and point B represents 20,000 vaccinations per year and 10,000 smoke detectors per year, and we can also do that through point A because that is also affordable and ISO cost is intersecting it. and point A represents 20,000 smoke detectors and 10,000 vaccinations, and the result would be same. Result would be saving of 5,000 lives. So as a policy maker, what would be the best possible alternative over here? Now I hope you can see it over here, because it is very obvious, because that combination, B combination, also represents 5,000 lives and saving of 5,000 lives, and combination A represents saving of 5,000 lives. So what would be the optimal one? Because the one that is being done that is being achieved by minimum cost. So as I said, that moving out of the origin, the outer ISO cost represents higher cost. So point A is being intersected by an ISO cost line which is more expensive than point B, because it is at a lower ISO cost line. So lower ISO cost lines represents lesser level of cost than outer ISO cost. So the ideal point is basically where ISO count is tangent to an ISO cost. So that would be point B, and that would be representing the cost effectiveness analysis. And I hope you can see over here that this analysis, economic analysis and program budgeting, with pairing together or grouping together all programs of various agencies which have the similar objective, and the objective was 5,000, and the aim of this cost effectiveness analysis is that what would be the minimum cost scenario, or what would be the minimum cost method of achieving that objective. And we can see over here through this graph is that point B represents minimum cost, and that was achieved only by grouping these programs together of various agencies which have the similar objective. And this could not have been done if all these programs are evaluated on independent basis, and there is no comparative analysis among them in terms of ISO count and ISO cost, and it would be very difficult for policymakers to evaluate which program is the best optimal program, and how can we allocate the budget in between them, these two programs, which would result the optimal level of output. So they might choose point A, and point A would be representing again the 5,000 saved lives, and they would choose 20,000 smoke detectors per year and 10,000 vaccinations per year by the government as a public good, but that point A is more expensive than point B. So the same objective of saving 5,000 lives can be achieved by a lesser cost scenario, which is the purpose of cost effectiveness analysis. Now, as I have been discussing, the aim of cost effectiveness analysis is to reduce the cost of achieving a specific goal. The goal in our example was saving of 5,000 lives, and that objective has been achieved by the government, and but at the lowest possible cost. Now, another advantage of cost effectiveness analysis is that it encourages competition among various government agencies, because various government agencies, as we discussed in our last lecture, that the aim of bureaucracy is to get more power, their aim might be to get more power, and for that they need more resources, and those resources can be acquired through allocation of more budget. So basically that aim would be achieved in a sense that if government evaluates each program separately, and they are not required to define the objectives of each and every program very clearly. So in this scenario, the government agencies are competing among each other, and the result would be improved effectiveness of each agency's program, because if every one of them need to define the objective of their program, and for example saving of 5,000 lives by maybe fire protection agency and maybe health services agency, then their competition to acquire that some certain quantity of budget would be maximum, and they would be required required to clearly define their objectives. Now competition, as always, brings in very positive outcomes, because then over here we can see that it can also encourage innovations, new and better programs, and newer and dynamic ways to achieve certain objectives and to acquire budget. The main aim of the agencies is still the same, but government is utilizing, or the policymakers are utilizing those aims, which are like, for example, increase the size of their budgets for the maximum best possible outcome. So in that scenario, it would encourage innovation, it would improve the productivity, of course, because they would be competing with each other for specific budget allocation, and that competition would result into improved productivity. They would be aiming to reduce costs, for example, and because specifically the government would also be using program budgeting method to reduce the costs. Then because the cost would be reduced, there would be a reduced burden on the taxpayers. If a similar program, as we saw, that if the government could choose maybe through line budgeting rather than program budgeting, government could allocate maybe say the program of saving 5,000 lives and evaluating all those programs independently, they might choose program A. But when they saw all the programs with similar objectives together in one pool and conducting an analysis of cost effectiveness, so that would result into a reduced cost, which was the point B. So same objective was achieved at a lesser cost, and with a lesser cost there would be less tax burden on the citizens of the country who would be financing all those activities of the government. Then another sort of budgeting that is being used, that is used usually, that is budgeting as an incremental process. Now budgeting, the activity of budgeting actually utilizes a lots of resources of the government, and it is a very costly activity. So one of the methods that government might use is they consider that the previous year's budget was an outcome of collective choices and a political equilibrium. So that budget stands over there, and based on that we only need to evaluate what do we need more. So they would make the previous year's budget as the base year, because those things have come through the political process, and those things are the political equilibrium of last year, and those are result of previous collective choices or collective choices of the last year. So all we need to do is what we need to do for this year. So that would be sort of an incremental budgeting process. Now what is the aim of the government is, it seeks to minimize the resources that go into the budgetary process each year, because as I said, the processing of the budgetary process actually takes a lot of resources, and if the government uses the incremental budgeting process rather than every time evaluating each and every program, then it would be for example minimizing the use of those resources and saving cost. And also since they came out of previous years public choices and previous years political equilibriums, so it reduces the chances of political conflict, and then this also avoids the disruptive changes in the government spending, because then if previous spendings are as the base year, only incremental spendings are considered, then there wouldn't be any major fluctuations in the government's budgeting process and the total government spending. Then there is another type of technique which can be used, which is cost-benefit analysis. Now, cost-benefit analysis is a practical technique for relative merits of alternative government projects. Now, in this scenario, each government project is basically evaluated on the basis of its marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. Now, as we discussed, that marginal social benefits and marginal social cost are not actually the only actually the cost of the project is not the only cost. There are certain external costs also, and when we add those external costs in the direct cost, that would be social cost. And same in the same scenario, the benefits would not be just the outcomes. There are certain positive externalities, and if we add those externalities, those outcomes into the benefits, that would be the total social benefit. So the projects are supposed to be evaluated and on the basis of marginal social benefit and marginal social cost. And I hope you remember, as I have repeated again and again, because this term would keep on coming, and you need to remember this. And we have used this term from I guess the second or third lecture up till now. Whenever marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost, then that project should not be taken, because previously we discussed that whenever marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost, that project should be taken, and whenever marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit, the quantity should be reduced. So that was in terms of increase in quantity of goods. Now we are coming to the public expenditure. Now in terms of public expenditure, it would be the government projects that would increase the quantity or produce more public goods. So whenever for a given project marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost, it would be that project might be approved. And if marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit, that project should not be considered even at the first level. So basically, cost benefit analysis is a very simpler activity. It has been used by for example many countries and in many scenarios. Now a statement of it is basically a statement of pros and cons of an activity. That would mean that if you take up an activity, we would discuss like various steps through which cost benefit analysis is done. Remember that we are trying to evaluate over here different methodologies or discuss different methodologies of budgeting and process of the government and government spending. As I said, that this is the second part of the overall public finance. The first part was role of the government in the economy, and then we discussed various scenarios how government would affect the market and cause efficient and inefficient outcomes. We discussed the political processes through which various outcomes are chosen. We discussed how different rules are defined in the constitution and how those rules are applicable and what are the pros and cons of those rules. Now we are coming to how, if there are government spending opportunities, and how the government would spend and how the government would choose among various alternatives. Now the first option that we discussed was cost efficiency analysis. Then we discussed that government would define projects based on incremental budgeting, and now we are coming to cost benefit analysis. A cost benefit analysis is one of the most used analysis technology in analysis method in certain developed countries. Now not on a broader scale, but maybe for certain projects. Now you would see various examples of cost benefit analysis, and we would be very clear on that how cost benefit analysis can be conducted. Now cost benefit analysis is actually it depends a lot on the judgment of the analyst, and it requires involvement of not just the economists but also maybe engineers and scientists, because we need to calculate the cost of various government programs as well as the benefits of various government programs. So what basically cost benefit analysis is, it is a list or a statement of pros and cons of any government program. Whenever the government takes up a certain activity, what would be the marginal social benefit or the social benefit out of it, and what would be the social cost, not just the cost in terms of the spending or operational cost, but also the social cost, including all the external cost. And we would discuss that the costs are basically the costs are of two types, direct cost and indirect cost. Direct cost are the costs that are very visible and are just being incurred, but then there are external effects which are termed as indirect cost, and those also need to be included to convert the operational cost into a social cost. And same is with the same scenario is with social benefit, because it is not just the benefit out of which it is sometimes very difficult to price certain government products, but if we can price certain government products, then there would also be other benefits that come out of it for surrounding community, and those benefits also need to be considered whenever taking a government program or starting a government project. So as we defined earlier, that projects should be considered when marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost, and should not be considered when marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit. Now, so over here it is mentioned very clearly on the slide that benefits must include indirect effects, and cost, other indirect effects would mean benefits would include also the benefits that are not very obvious, and even there are externalities involved. So those should also be included in the overall benefits, so to make it a social benefit. And then cost must also include opportunity cost, because whenever government takes up a project, in some sense there is an opportunity cost of those resources that are being employed in that project, because that would be taking out resources from the private sector and putting those resources up for a government activity, and that would mean the private sector would have lesser resources. So we need to consider the opportunity cost, in a sense, that the best other use of those resources which is foregone, and what would be the cost of that also. So cost benefit analysis is a very dynamic sort of analysis. There are basically three steps to conducting the cost benefit analysis. The first step is to enumerate all cost and benefits of the proposed project. Enumerate would mean, which we have discussed in the last slide, that cost benefit analysis is basically a list of steps, a list of pros and cons. So enumerate would mean to make a list of all the cost and benefits of the proposed project. Then we need to evaluate all cost and benefits in the dollar terms, because it would be very important to calculate, because if we need to do the comparison, it is very difficult. For example, in terms of any government activity to protect human lives, or any government activity to prevent accidents on the road, we need to see the benefits in terms of dollar values, because it would not pay to say, it would not be comparable when we say that cost is $100 million and the lives saved are, like, for example, 500 lives saved. So how can we compare those two? So what we need to do is we need to put a dollar value on those lives saved, and that would be discussed later on in the slide, because that is the most difficult and most debatable thing to do. So evaluate all cost and benefits in terms of dollars. So first we make the list of all the cost and benefits of the proposed project, and then we evaluate them, and we assign dollar values to all cost and benefits. And since the programs or projects are for a longer period of time, what we need to do is we need to discount all the future values in terms of cost and in terms of benefits, and discount them to the present value. And when we discount them to the present value, now they are comparable with each other, and in the present value we can see that whether marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit, in which case the project would be rejected, or marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost and there is net marginal benefit, and the project would be accepted. So there is again a huge debate on the rate of discount, which we would be discussing in this lecture as well, that it is very easy to say that at certain rate of return the future benefits and future cost would be discounted to the present value, but then the issue is what should be the rate of that discount. So along these three steps, there is a greater debate within each step. Now it is important to say over here that all of these steps are as important as the other one. You cannot say that deciding on the discount rate and discounting process is less important than evaluation of cost and benefits in terms of dollars. So all of these steps are very important, because if a mistake in terms of for example listing of cost and benefits is done in the start of the project analysis, cost and benefit analysis, then that mistake would carry on to the last step, which is the discount of future net benefits. And maybe the list was fine in the start, but in the end we use the wrong discount factor, then the project might be rejected, a project which should have been accepted. And similarly, if we fail to put dollar values in true dollar values in terms of cost and benefits, which is no doubt a very difficult thing, and it needs certain intrinsic evaluations by the analyst and very arbitrary steps. But the point is that all of them are very important to actually evaluate the project, and we would be discussing them through examples maybe in the next lecture, in which we would be showing certain examples where in certain cases there have been mistakes, and those mistakes have been carried on to the end of the project. So moving on, we would discuss the first step, where there is enumerating benefits and cost. Enumerating would mean making a list of all the benefits and costs. What we need to do over here is that all we need to do is that we need to make a list of the benefits and costs, and also there are two types of benefits and costs. There are direct costs and indirect costs, and there are direct benefits and indirect benefits. Direct benefits and direct costs are the ones which are directly attributable to the project. You start a project, for example, maybe a government irrigation facility in a certain rural area. Now there are certain outcomes that you can immediately see out of that project. There are certain costs involved: the direct cost, the labor cost, the cost of, for example, acquiring land for that irrigation facility, cost of labor and capital employed, cost of hiring of contractors. But those costs are direct costs. Then there are direct benefits. That benefit would go to, for example, increased water flow to farmers, and then there is again debate over how to put a dollar value on increased water flow, but that is not the scope of enumerating benefits and costs. That is like when it goes towards evaluating the benefits and costs. Then there are indirect and cost and benefits. Indirect cost and benefits are those attributed to the project that were not part of the intended purpose of the project. Those are indirect effects which was not actually under the project scope. Those just originated from just taking up that project, and that can be, for example, in terms of indirect cost, that can be, for example, a decreased water level in some other region, or maybe less water supply in other region because you have started an irrigation facility in area X, and then you have drawn out water from area Y, and there would be decreased output from over there. Then there are indirect benefits also. Maybe the farmer next to that irrigated area would also benefit from it, and maybe the water level below the surface would rise in that area, and the farmer who's not in that irrigation range might also enjoy by extracting that water from the tube well. So there are also indirect benefits, and he would be better off again. So there are indirect costs and indirect benefits, and while making a list of benefits and cost, we need to consider the direct cost as well as indirect cost, and direct benefits as well as indirect benefits, because the total social cost would be direct cost plus the indirect cost, as well as the total social benefit would be direct benefits plus indirect benefits. And that is how we highlighted that it is very important that we not only, because when we discussed positive and negative externalities of various government activities, we discussed that it is very, very important not to just see the immediate cost and immediate benefits, but also to evaluate the external effects of those activities. Like over here, the contract or transaction is being conducted by government and those farmers for whom the irrigation facility is being installed. But then there are third parties which are being affected in terms of negative externality and in terms of positive externality, and those actually need to be incorporated in your analysis, in for example this cost benefit analysis, so that there is an efficient level of that public good that is supposed to be provided. Because if one of the cost or a few of the benefits and few of the costs are not included, then the output level would be inefficient. We have discussed that in starting lectures of role of the government in the economy. Now Moving on, I have already discussed this example. Now let's take this example on. There are direct and indirect benefits. First, we would, when making a list of benefits and costs, let us discuss the direct and indirect benefits first. Now let's take as an example, consider a government's irrigation project. Now to increase the fertility of a particular tract of land, the government wants to start an irrigation project in certain area. Let us consider in a rural area where the water supply is scarce, and what they want to do is they want to install an irrigation facility. So when in that area the fertility of land would increase. Now when taking up that project, the government need to see direct benefits and indirect benefits. Direct benefits would be increase in the output because the land is more fertile now, and the existing farmers over there would be getting more output of it. So there would be increased land productivity, and then there would be indirect benefits. Now as I said, that increase in adjoining land's output, because if that irrigation facility is installed, maybe for example a specific area surrounding certain region, the water bed level under the surface would increase for that overall area, because water would seep in, and that can also benefit other farmers surrounding that area, because they can also pump that water out and irrigate their land. In this case, we need to consider the direct in terms of, while considering the direct and indirect benefits, we need to, when evaluating those benefits, we need to consider that we need to avoid the problem of double counting. Now for example, if we are considering the benefits, then it might be that because of better fertility, there is increase in the value of that land, and we might include that increase in value of that land in indirect benefits. But if you look at this, there is already increased output in that area, and that increased output is because of the fertile land, and that is why the value of the land has increased. So that increased output has all, in terms of price, in terms of when it is there is a price tag on it. If there is a price tag on it, then that increase in output also already accounts for the increase in value of the land. So if we add the increase in output in terms of dollar values, and we add increase in the value of land, that would be a double counting. So we need to consider, when making a list of benefits and direct and indirect benefits, that we need to avoid the problem of double counting. The basic issue in this problem, which I should have mentioned a few points earlier, then when we start an irrigation facility, the main benefit to the farmer is the flow of water. Now that increased flow of water, in fact. Now that increased flow of water is very difficult to price, because in the existence of no rights on the water, or in non-existence of any market for provision of water, it would be very difficult to put a price tag on that increased flow. So to use one solution would be for example, to see the increase in the output because of that increase in water flow. So actually what we are doing is, the direct benefit of that irrigation project is increased water flow to the farmer. What we are doing over here is, we are taking increased output, which is very easily convertible to dollar values when it is sold in the market, and that increased output is a proxy of the original benefit to the farmer, which was increased water flow to the farmer. Since we cannot actually price the increased water flow, we use a proxy for increased water flow, which is increase in output. I hope you understand this. So that is why the first direct benefit is increase in the output rather than increase in the water flow, because increase in water flow cannot be priced. So we are using a proxy. A proxy is that when it is very, I hope you know what a proxy is. Maybe I should explain it right now. A proxy is actually when you cannot actually count or calculate something, or quantitatively put a number on something, then you use a proxy. For example, in certain cases, when we are doing econometric analysis or mathematical calculations, we use, for example, we might use, for example, example, level of education as a proxy for intelligence. Now it is very difficult, except for the IQ test, it is usually very difficult to see, to calculate the ability actually. Let's focus on ability. A student's ability needs to be evaluated. Now how would you measure a student's ability? Now one way is to proxy his exam results as his ability. The other way is to see his total score or the level of education that he has as ability. The other thing can be take his IQ test to see his ability. So in order to proxy ability, we have certain quantitative proxies. So in this case, a proxy of increased water flow to the farmer is increase in the output. Then with increase in income of the farmer, there would be increase in retail sales in the area. Now there is a question mark on that, because whether it is an indirect benefit or not. The question mark is because those increased incomes might be deriving more retailers out of certain other area, or that income is still certain level of income is fixed in the economy. So those higher income levels in this area might be result of decreased income level in other areas. So those retail sales might be an indirect benefit for the farmer over here, but it would also be an indirect cost for some other area. So those two would cancel out. So there is a big question mark whether to add such kind of indirect benefits in the total projects or not, and then that would come to the analyst who would be analyzing the results to see whether retail sales are to be included or not. Then there are direct and indirect costs of that irrigation project. We are taking irrigation project as an example to continue or to understand the benefits and costs, or enumerating benefits and costs. In the previous slide we discussed enumerating of benefits, direct and indirect benefits, and in this slide we would be discussing the direct and indirect costs. The project is to increase the fertility of a particular tract of land. That is a government project, and in order to actually evaluate that project in terms of cost and benefits, we need to consider all the costs and all the benefits. So while considering the direct cost, resources employed in the project, for example, when taking up that irrigation project, maybe we need to consider the capital employed while maybe digging canals or digging of an artificial lake for that area, water reservoir, and then we need to see the cost of acquiring that land on which there is acquiring that land on which that water reservoir is being built, or those canals are being built. So there are direct costs also, and then there are indirect costs also, because the water that is being provided to those farmers for that reservoir and for the better irrigation project might be coming from certain other areas, and the output level of that area might decrease. So there would be a decreased water level in surrounding areas or maybe further away. So that decreased water level is an indirect cost in that sense. Then there is another indirect cost. For example, if you when resources are employed and when there is a lake, then that water reservoir and those irrigation canals would result into decreased land that can be made fertile, or decreased land on which wheat or for example crop can be harvested. So that would again be an indirect cost of that. So in this slide we have discussed the direct cost and indirect cost, and this is under the first step, enumerating costs, benefits and costs, which would be making a list of all the benefits and costs. Then the second step would come up, which is evaluating cost and benefits in terms of the dollars. Now it is very important to see the actual dollar value, but though some cost and benefits are easily quantifiable, like others others such as value of human life saved or lost because of a project are not as easy. Now we would be coming to the value of human life later on, but as I said, the direct cost and indirect cost that we are discussing under the irrigation project, certain costs are very easily quantifiable. For example, the amount of labor you employ, the amount of capital you employ for that irrigation project, or for example the land you acquire in terms of dollars. Those are like some costs that are easily attributable to the project. But what about the indirect cost? How would you, it would be very difficult to quantify the decreased water level in the surrounding areas from which water is being provided to this area. Then it would be again very difficult to quantify. It is quantifiable, but very difficult to quantify the amount of land that has been foregone for that irrigation facility, or maybe for that water reservoir that has been built over there. When evaluating that list or any other list, it is very difficult to quantify, for example, the value of human life saved or lost from any government program. It is very difficult to put a dollar value on benefits of health and education, because benefits of health and education are might, for example, you can use, there are certain proxies which we might use. For example, output of a project. What would be the output of a project which is not actually sold in the market? Because when a private sector profit maximizing firm takes up a project of, for example, making building new screens or cameras, or the screen that you are watching me on, or this camera which is recording me, or a PowerPoint software, those products are marketable and it is very easy to see their cost and benefits. But the government projects like an irrigation facility, or maybe new roads and new highways or dams, it is very difficult to see the cost of those projects in terms of opportunity cost also, because we need to add that, and in terms of benefits that are derived, because those are not actually sold in the market. Do not consider like the toll that you pay on motorway. The benefits are of a motorway are much broader than just paying a toll. Maybe we pay only 200 or 300 rupees while going from traveling across the motorway from one end to other. But do you actually think that that is the cost of that facility? There has been like spent millions and billions of dollars to build that motorway. Now, and there has been costs for like acquiring that land, and then there have been external benefits and costs to those surrounding areas through which the motorway has passed or a national highway has passed. So it is very difficult to put a dollar value on government projects which are not actually being sold in the market. And same is the case of this irrigation facility. That is a project which would have its returns very later on in terms of well-being of those farmers who are being provided with an irrigation facility, in terms of the output that is being produced for the country, which is being added in the GDP of the country. But at that given moment, that project is not being sold, and it is being financed by taxes. So how to put a dollar value on that project? So what we do is we use surrogate measures. Surrogate measures would be, for example, proxies that would be evaluating the benefits and cost in terms of dollar terms. For example, increased earnings of those who have benefited from health program. If certain individuals had been treated for example, lung disease, or for example, in Pakistan's case, there are polio vaccinations being as a major program being conducted in the country, and children are being vaccinated. How would you evaluate the benefit of that project? One way would be, when those children grow up, what would be their earning power, maybe what are the earning opportunities, and that can be for example the benefits of eradicating that disease. And then, for example, if you consider the spending of government on maybe higher education, when they send so many individuals for PhDs in foreign countries, in case of Pakistan by Higher Education Commission. Now there is a huge cost on that. It is not just the cost of the scholarships that are paid or fees to the universities that are paid. There are other costs also. So there are other benefits also. The benefits are not just in terms of those people being awarded higher degrees, but benefit is how can you evaluate somebody's higher degrees benefit to them. Maybe it can be proxied by their earning power, and then there are external benefits also, because when they come back they conduct research, when they come back they teach other students and they incorporate their knowledge on other people. So how would you evaluate the benefits to the larger society? So it is very difficult to evaluate cost and benefits of government projects, because they are not sold. All of those projects are not sold in the market like any product of a private firm. Now, marketable output, but price and cost doesn't reflect true social value. The first scenario was in a case when the products were not marketable in the market, but then the second case is the product is marketable in the market, but the cost, the prices and the cost do not reflect the actual dollar value. For example, products sold in monopolistic markets or under government taxes and subsidies. Now, in terms of a monopolistic market, the prices of the inputs that are being acquired from that monopolistic market structure would be higher than what they should have been under competition. And so if government taxes and subsidies are distorting the efficient level of prices, then that would again need to be incorporated, because when the product is marketable and being sold in the market. Now, as an example, take the agri output. If agri prices are subsidized and there is a minimum ceiling, minimum floor on the agricultural prices, then how can you evaluate the actual market prices? It would be if you take that government floor as the price of the output, and you, while putting a dollar value on cost and benefit, you treat that subsidy, then you are overestimating the results. And there is need to reflect the true social value. You need to consider the actual social cost and social benefits of the outputs and the inputs that are being taken in those projects. Now, all this process might require arbitrary estimating decisions by the analyst, but they need to be considered. Of course, there might be certain mistakes, but as I said earlier, that all these steps are very important, and mistake at one step might result into a continuous chain of mistakes. So over here, now we come to the discounting future net benefits, how we take up the convert discounts or discounting future net benefits to the present value. But this would be a longer debate, and I guess we are running out of time over here. So what we would do is, in the next lecture we would continue from over here, right over from this slide. And before I say goodbye to you guys, I would summarize the lecture of cost and benefit analysis and of government investments. So we were discussing the cost and benefit analysis and government investments, because now, while coming in this lecture, while coming towards the public expenditure, it is very important to conduct the analysis of the budget process. We considered the three budgetary processes of the government. The first one was cost effectiveness analysis. Under this, we considered the budget programs. In budget program, the program budgeting was basically the process in which the various the proposals of various agencies of the government are put together, all those proposals which have a similar objective, so that the government can evaluate those objectives altogether. And this is not possible in the line budgeting. The whole purpose of this is program budgeting is to first of all to allow policymakers to see trade-off between various programs for various agencies, all those programs which have similar objective, and also to see the least cost method of taking up that activity to meeting that objective. As an example, we considered an isocont and certain budget lines, and this isocont represented two programs of government agencies, maybe Fire Protection Department and Health Ministry or Health Agency, and the aim of their project or the objective was to increase human life. And that was example was like both of these projects are targeting to save lives up to 5,000 individuals. Now, in this isocont, we saw that there are basically we can only take up those projects where the isocont is touching the iso cost, because at that point, for example, point B, there are 20,000 vaccinations and 10,000 smoke detectors. Now these 20,000 vaccinations and smoke detectors represent the optimal point. Why? Because point B is tangent to the isocont, while point A is just is also achievable at 20,000 vaccinations and 10,000 vaccinations and 20,000 fire detecting detectors per year. But the point is that point A was at a higher ISO cost rather than point B. So point B would be the most least cost effective, least cost method of taking up the same activity. The program of the same objective would be saving 5,000 lives. Now then in cost effective analysis, we saw that the government can reduce the cost by comparing programs of various agencies which might be targeting a similar objective, and that would encourage competition among various government agencies in terms of improved effectiveness, encourage innovation, improved productivity, reduced cost, and since the cost is reduced, then reduced burden on the taxpayers. Then we discussed that governments often use incremental budget. What would be the incremental budget is that the government would take the previous year's budget, add as a base budget, and then would only see what we need to add this year. The aim of this is that, considering that previous year budget was the output of a public choice, a collective choice basically outcome, and it was a political equilibrium also. So by using that, they would be minimizing the use of resources that are incorporated into a whole budgetary process. They would also be reducing the amount of political conflict, because political parties had already agreed upon that budget last year, and they would avoid disruptive changes in the government spending. Then we considered the third type of analysis, which is cost benefit analysis, which we are focusing right now. It is basically whenever every government project is evaluated in terms of social benefits and social cost, and the programs with higher social benefit than social cost are accepted, while the programs with higher social cost and social benefit are rejected in this case. So it is a very simpler sort of analysis, while complexities arise during the process when the analysis is being conducted. It is a statement of pros and cons of all the activities of the government and all the costs that are incorporated in it. It actually considers, it takes up through 3 steps. The first step is making a list of all the benefits and costs that are arising due to that project. Then the second step is like evaluating those each benefit and cost in terms of the dollar value, which we discussed is a very difficult thing to do. And then in the last step, the discounting of future benefits and cost to the present value, so that you can evaluate the social benefit and social cost. Now we missed the discount of future net benefits in the current lecture, which we would be covering in the next lecture. Now we have only covered the first 2, enumerating all costs and benefits, and evaluating all costs and benefits. In terms of enumerating or making a list of cost and benefits, we considered direct cost as well as indirect cost, and in this process we took an example of an irrigation facility by the government to improve the fertility of land, and we considered the direct benefits and as well as indirect benefits, and we discussed over here, and while discussing direct and indirect benefits and costs, that sometimes it is very difficult to assign dollar value to direct benefits and direct costs, or indirect benefits and indirect costs, and we need to use surrogate measures, or for example proxies that would be almost same as that direct benefit. For example, we discussed that it is the actual benefit coming out to the farmer from that irrigation facility is increased flow of water. Now there is no market for that flow of water, so how would you put a dollar or price tag on that water that he is getting? So what you would do is you would measure the increase in the output or the marginal productivity of that increased flow of water, and since that output by the farmer is actually priced in the market, so you can proxy that for the increased flow of water. So we also discussed that we need to consider the indirect benefits, which would be increased water level for adjoining lands, and we also discussed that we need to avoid the problem of double counting, and there are certain benefits that that are questionable, which need to be debated. Then there are direct and indirect costs. Then we discuss direct and indirect cost of the irrigation facility, and same like benefits. There are direct costs would be certain costs like resources employed in the project in terms of capital, labor, purchase of land, and indirect cost would be cost to the adjoining land or cost of, for example, that acquired land which would not be used for agriculture purposes anymore. Now then we came to evaluating and in other words putting a dollar value or price tag on cost and benefits. Now there are some cost and benefits which are difficult to tag. For example, what would be the value of human life, and I said we would discuss that later. We would try to find methods in which we can put a price tag on that. That would be wrong to say, but still difficult to put dollar value benefits from, for example, health and education. And again, in these measures we can use when the certain projects are not sold in the market, then the difficulty is that how do we put a price tag on that. And in this scenario we can, for example, in terms of health, we can see the increased earnings of the individuals after that health program, or in terms of education we can see the increased education increased earnings of those former students. Then we also consider the scenario in which the products are marketable, but there are certain inefficiencies, and the prices and costs do not reflect the true social prices and social cost or social benefit and social cost. For example, we consider that government subsidies to agri farmers would result into distortion of what price should be included in the benefit, because that government subsidy has distorted the actual marketable price. Then we consider that inputs coming from monopolistic markets might result into overpriced inputs, and they do not reflect the true social value. And so the analyst might need to incorporate certain arbitrary measures. Now after this we were supposed to go to the discount factor and the debate over the social rate of discount, which we would continue in the next lecture, because we are out of time right now. So hope to see you in next lecture. Take care. Allah Hafiz.